Hi, everyone. I hope that you are still doing okay, given the circumstances. However you're doing is fine, I guess. You don't feel like you have to be feeling any particular way. I wanted to just give a brief reflection. I read the discussion post that I created for you last week, and a lot of you obviously chose to respond to the first question just about how you're doing. I do hope that that provided a space for you to just kind of let some of your thoughts out about how you're feeling about this whole situation. And I was heartened to read a lot of your responses. And this just goes back to what I said a second ago. There is no way you should be feeling right now. No one knows how to be feeling because it was all so sudden and also um, abrupt as an interruption to our daily lives and our daily routines. And I think that's what most of you are feeling. It's been a couple weeks now, at least, and so maybe you've started to cope a little bit better than you initially did. But I think, again, there's no way you should be feeling it. However you're feeling is fine. Um, some of you suggest to others that they should use this as a time to develop new hobbies and new routines, and that's great. If that's something that all of you are able to do right now is to develop new hobbies and routines and to rediscover lost passions or something like that, that's fine. But if you're also not rediscovering lost passions or new hobbies, that's also fine too. Because I don't think anyone would blame you if the current circumstances don't provide you with the motivation you might need to rediscover lost passions or take up new hobbies. While I think the suggestion is you will get incredibly bored and get lost in your thoughts and become anxious if all you do is kind of sit around. That's a good sentiment. But it's also true that you may just not have the motivation or the interest that you would otherwise have to rediscover new. So the point is, these are not normal circumstances. However, your feeling is fine, and that's about it. No one knows exactly how to feel because this is all affecting us differently. Some of you personally know someone who is affected by this, whether it's someone in your family or if you live in a part of the country that's affected by this. Um, so the point is, I appreciated all of your honesty and all of your advice to each other. It seems like a lot of you are doing the best you can given the circumstances, and that's all anyone can expect. So if you need someone to talk to, please just know that I am here. Reach out to me, send me an email, whatever the case might be. That said, I do want to just talk a little bit about what's going on this week and then in the weeks that follow. There are 3 full weeks left, including this week. Excuse me. This week we start reading Hannah Arendt, and we read her this week and next week. You will have a quiz on Wednesday on the Martin Luther King readings. I will give you 24 hours to complete the quiz, like I did last week. If you are in the third group, you have an analysis due this week on Arendt, and then that's it. There are no more analyses. So this is the last one. So there's nothing due next week or the week after regarding analyses. There will be another discussion post this week and next week. I don't know about the last week of class yet. I'll let you know. I don't suspect there will be. You do have a second paper that is due Sunday, April 26th. And I did post some ideas for you to write about if you're interested. If you don't want to write, again, you can just choose to write on one of the first paper prompts, but you may decide that's not something you want to do, and you can choose from among the other ideas I've given you. Or if you have some other idea, you can email me and let me know. But again, the paper's due Sunday, April 26th. There will be an optional final exam. Given that now Clemson has officially instituted this pass fail option for all of you, you may decide you don't even want it, that none of you want to take the final exam. But if that is something you want to do, it is an option. I will give it, and I will have more to say soon. But you should start thinking about if you want to take that final exam, you should send me an email soon letting me know, making me aware of that. My sense might be, again, that a lot of you choose just not to do it because of the pass fail thing, but let me know. I think that's it. Um, I want to then talk about Hannah Arendt. What I'm going to do is I'm going to post a link to a short essay that I wrote for the site 1000 Word Philosophy, which gives you a kind of brief introduction to her thought. I'm going to post a link to that when I post this lecture video, and I encourage you to read that. As I indicated to some of you in class, Hannah Arendt was the figure who I wrote my dissertation on in graduate school, so I do have a pretty strong familiarity with her thought, and I think you'll find as you start reading her that she is very accessible and not difficult to read. Um, Arendt, though she was born in Germany during the second, no, she was born in Germany in the early 20th century and was in Germany, she's Jewish, in Germany during the Second World War, fled Germany to France during the Second World War, and then she spent a large part of her life in the United States, teaching at various schools, the New School in um, New York and the University of Chicago. She spent a large portion of her life here. And she came to grow quite fond of a lot of American institutions, in particular the U.S. Constitution, the doctrine of the separation of powers, the American Revolutionary experience, and the phenomenon of civil disobedience that's the subject of the essays we're reading in this class. Arendt has some unique things to say about civil disobedience, and we turn to her writings because she um, clarifies the meaning of what she considers the phenomenon of civil disobedience. And that's what it is for her. Civil disobedience is not just a concept or a word that can just be defined. It is a phenomenon. It is a political phenomenon that is emergent and that requires interpretation and understanding. And that's what she's up to in this essay, is that she wants to interpret it as a phenomenon that she was witnessing and experiencing during the 1960s and the 1970s, which was a very turbulent time in the United States. And so she wants to present her understanding of civil disobedience against a number of other phenomena um, with which she thinks civil disobedience is getting conflated. And so she seeks to clarify the meaning of the phenomenon of civil disobedience against a number of other political activities that she thinks it needs to be distinguished from. And so the short reading that you had for today was just her kind of reflecting upon a conference that had been held in 1970 where well, what does she say? So I have the book here in front of me. I'm looking at page 51 that you had to read for today, and she's reflecting on a meeting of the Bar Association of the City of New York, where they had gathered to discuss the question, is the law dead? And something that came up in the context of this larger discussion of whether the law is dead is the question, quote, and this is on 51, the citizen's moral relation to the law in a society of consent. So that is the framework for thinking about civil disobedience in that bar meeting association. She kind of uses the minutes and the reflections from this meeting as a way in to her own discussion of civil disobedience. And the question of a citizen's moral relation to the law in a society of consent. So the idea, again, that kind of presupposes social contract theory, that we do consent to the law. And the idea is that if we consent to the law, we should also be able to withdraw our consent. That consent, if consent is truly voluntary, which I realize by now a lot of you have thought it's not, but if consent, conceptually at least, consent is voluntary, it also must mean we can withdraw our consent if we wish to. And So that's the question, and it seems as though what Arendt is going to say, to an extent, is that civil disobedience represents our ability to register our consent. Civil disobedience will be her way of responding to Locke's problem of tacit consent. Civil disobedience will be the way that citizens can express consent, but through dissent. And that point will come later. But that's some important context that will come up later in the essay. But again, her reflections here in this first part are just to kind of push back against, or to at least give you a sense of how she's going to start pushing back against some of the ways that these individuals at this meeting were reflecting on civil disobedience. So reading from the bottom of this page here on 51, it says, the literature on the subject, and this is in reference to the citizen's moral relation to the law, the literature on the subject relies to large extent on two famous men in prison, Socrates in Athens and Thoreau in Concord, Massachusetts. Their conduct is the joy of jurists because it seems to prove that disobedience to the law can only be justified if the lawmaker is willing and even eager to accept punishment for his act. So that is sort of her first reflection on this subject of civil disobedience and what precisely civil disobedience is. So these images from not only philosophy, but kind of popular cultural images of who and what a civil disobedient is and what they're engaged in. She references two well-known images, Socrates and Thoreau. And indeed, the reading for Wednesday immediately picks up with Socrates and Thoreau. But I just want to say the reason she kind of is that Socrates and Thoreau call to mind the image of the disobedient, and there I mean disobedient as a noun, not as a verb, but the disobedient as someone who's kind of engaged in their action and is sitting in prison, accepting the consequences for their action. Socrates and Thoreau. Socrates, was engaged in questioning the people of Athens as the gadfly, and he was sent to prison as a result of this, and then he refused to escape from prison. And it seems to be now you might have thought of the disobedient act would have been to escape from prison, but nonetheless, Socrates is this image of somebody who has rebelled against the government and is willing to accept their punishment. Same with Thoreau. Thoreau refused to pay a poll tax because he did not want to be supporting I think it was the Mexican-American War at the time. He refused to pay a poll tax, and he was sent to prison. And he was willing to accept his punishment. And so Socrates and Thoreau are there's these images of them as the civil disobedience who engaged in an unjust act and were sent to jail and accepted their punishment. And that, for Arendt, is the popular image of what the civil disobedient does and what they engaged in. And indeed, one of the powerful images is that Socrates and Thoreau were solitary individual men who engaged in their action and said, I refuse to obey the law. Send me to prison. I will accept my punishment. And for someone who's uncomfortable with the notion of civil disobedience or law breaking, the reason Arendt there at the bottom of that page, she says, well, how are we to make sense of this? And when she says their conduct is the joy of jurists, because it seems to prove that civil disobedience to the law can be justified only if the lawbreaker is willing and even eager to accept punishment. They have no problem. Yeah, go ahead, break the law, refuse to obey the law, engage in civil disobedience, but you better be willing to accept your punishment. And so there's not a real conundrum here. Somebody who might be uncomfortable with law breaking, is taken aback by the civil disobedient, but as long as they're willing to go to prison and accept their punishment, there's no problem. And then maybe that, and that's fine. But I think Arendt's concern with that kind of image is that there the civil disobedient gets conflated already with somebody who is a mere lawbreaker. a mere lawbreaker. Because, of course, the mere lawbreaker, somebody who just breaks any law, not unjust laws, but is simply must go to prison and accept their punishment. And so already there's a kind of conflation going on in thinking of the civil disobedient as simply a lawbreaker who must accept their punishment. That's already a conflation to lawbreaking as such that Arendt is concerned with. And so that's already, and that's going to come up again. So one of the activities that Arendt is concerned that she wants to distance civil disobedience from is mere lawbreaking. And that might be an obvious one. But the fact that we kind of think about the fact that civil disobedience must accept their punishment seems to reveal something of how we're sort of thinking about the civil disobedient and regarding them. Let me see what else she has to say in this first part, right? So again, she's just kind of reflecting on what's going on with civil disobedience as a result of this conference, as a result of some other. You'll see in footnotes she's referencing some specific writings here that others have talked about as how are individuals, especially those in the law profession, regarding civil disobedience. She's quoting a lot of law review articles here, those who were in law schools at the time. What is the right way to think about civil disobedience? And she's just trying to set up this context as a kind of backdrop and background against which she will pose her own arguments. And that's kind of what's going on with today's reading. She's reflecting on what's happening at the time. Of course, she wrote this essay. I forget the specific year that she wrote this essay, but again, this essay is being written in the context of the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement in the late 1960s, the early 1970s. So this is always regarded in U.S. history in the 20th century as one of the most turbulent periods because of the amount of protest going on, because of the dissatisfaction and the trust in the institutions of government, because of the Vietnam War, because of the Johnson and the Nixon administrations seemingly lying to the American people about the Vietnam War and when it was going to end, escalating the troops, even though they said they were going to bring the troops home, the draft, individuals that personally were being sent to fight in a war that nobody really understood why we were fighting it. We were doing it to sort of uproot communism, but nonetheless, the war itself did not enjoy very large support from large portions of the population, especially among college-age students. So this was a time period in American history where civil disobedience was happening all the time. And so Arendt kind of wants to say, look, this is happening, and we ought to make sense of this political phenomenon that is happening and emerging in large numbers all of the time, and we ought to regard civil disobedience as a special kind of political phenomenon and not one that we should just subsume under our traditional categories such as law breaking. So that's what the historical context of when she's writing this and reflecting on civil disobedience is crucial for understanding what she has to say as a phenomenon that is emerging, right? And that we ought not simply subsume civil disobedience under these sort of popular images of Thoreau and Socrates. So indeed, one of the other things that's going to come up in today's reading, and this will come up immediately in Wednesday's reading as well, is to think about it's not only mere law breaking that she's concerned about the conflation with, it's also the phenomenon she refers to as conscientious objection. So let's look at, I'm going to look at 55 here. And when she says, so second full paragraph, and this is crucial, whatever the actual cases of the period of turmoil, and they are, of course, factual and political ones, the present confusion, polarization, and growing bitterness of our debates are also caused by a theoretical failure to come to terms with and to understand the true character of the phenomenon. Right? So I keep referring to it as a phenomenon. And it's important because for Arendt, politics is about engaging in action with other people. And so it is a phenomenon in the sense that it is emergent. It is something to be made sense of as it emerges in real time, not as a static definition that remains constant. So that's why she calls it a phenomenon. Whenever the jurists attempt to justify the civil disobedient On moral and legal grounds, they construe his case in the image of either the conscientious objector or the man um, who tests the constitutionality of a statute. Right. So let's say something about both those. The conscientious objector for Arendt it's going to end up being somebody like Thoreau or Socrates will end up being somebody who is a conscientious objector. And the primary claim there is that Thoreau and Socrates were protesting the law on purely moral grounds. Purely moral grounds, which is to say they were concerned. So the reason it's conscientious objection is that it refers to the phenomenon of conscience, that voice up in your head that's kind of telling you what's the right thing to do and what the wrong thing to do is. It's often portrayed as kind of having like, the devil on one shoulder and the angel on the other shoulder, and they're kind of fighting between each other. So conscience is the voice inside your head. It's the voice that you have to live with. And when you go to sleep at night, the question is that voice nagging at you that you did the wrong thing, or is that voice kind of content that you have done the right thing? So it's me having to live with myself. It's the silent inner dialogue, as Arendt will say, between me and myself, the voice in my head. So conscientious objection is a purely moral phenomenon, which is concerned, so that, Socrates and Thoreau, the reason she's concerned with them is that they were these solitary individuals who protested the law, engaged in an unjust act, and went to prison. And they sat in their prison cells and they were alone. But they were content that they had done the right thing. They could live with themselves in a purely moral way. And so Arendt is concerned about the extent to which we regard civil disobedience on purely moral grounds, because for her, a moral claim is a claim about me being able to live with myself and having my conscience satisfied. That's her concern. Because for her, civil disobedience must, so going back to 55, when she says, the trouble is that the situation of the civil disobedient bears no analogy to either, for the simple reason that he never exists as a single individual. He can function and survive only as a member of a group. So that's the crucial difference here. It may, that civil disobedience requires a group of people. And Socrates, Thoreau, the conscientious objector, is simply regarded as a solitary individual who breaks the law and goes to prison. Or, again, somebody who tests the constitutionality of a statute. So, for example, the draft dodger, for example, who refused so this was obviously during the draft in the 1970s and 60s during the Vietnam War, this was a popular thing for individuals to do, was to refuse to go fight for your country in the war, simply refusing the draft. And so you go to prison. You go serve your time in jail because you refuse to go fight this war for your country. And for Arendt, that is still something that an individual does. You are testing the constitutionality of a law through your action. She's not casting judgment on the conscientious objector, not casting judgment on them, but she is concerned about the extent to which that is something that an individual can do. Any of us individually can do that. It doesn't require us necessarily. Now, you have to be willing to accept the punishment and go to jail, so maybe not all of you would be willing to do it, but any of us could theoretically, if we thought a law we didn't agree with a law, we could just break it and refuse it, and then we go to jail. And in that sense, we are testing whether a particular statute is within the range of the Constitution, which many who were avoiding the draft were saying that a draft is unconstitutional. And then Socrates and Thoreau were similarly, in particular Thoreau, who thought that Congress, who was fighting the Mexican-American War when there was slavery going on within their own borders of their country, similarly thought that the war was unconstitutional, and he refused to pay taxes to the government that would fight that war, but yet permit slavery within its own borders. And so he thought the war was unconstitutional. So again, the point is, there's nothing. This is not a judgment about whether the conscientious objector is good or bad. It's simply to say we ought to not take civil disobedience and just subsume it under familiar categories. We ought to try and give it its own definition and its own understanding and interpretation. So that's what's going on here. So one of the bigger themes. So to just kind of move beyond this particular reading, one of the bigger themes that's going on here that I want to think about, and this comes up in the other paper prompts, is that we just finished reading Martin Luther King, who is kind of so we have Socrates and Thoreau, but we also have Martin Luther King, who's kind of the paradigm of civil disobedience in U.S. history, at least. Martin Luther King, the civil rights movement, they are the paradigm for thinking about civil disobedience. And what's interesting is that Martin Luther King explicitly justifies disobedience in terms of the morality of the law, whether the laws are just or unjust. And as we've just seen, Arendt is concerned about the extent to which disobedience is only justified in terms of the justice or injustice of the law, because there will be a limitation to that kind of thing. Because morality for Arendt, the way she's thinking about morality, is that it's all about individual conscience, and that it doesn't call to mind, morality doesn't call to mind the public nature of disobedience, the group dimension, the group dynamic. So disobedience must be public, must be, and it also must be engaged in by a group. And for Arendt, morality, the domain of our lives that is concerned with morality, for her is an individual phenomenon, not necessarily a public or a group phenomenon. So she's concerned about the extent. So again, to kind of contextualize this bigger picture, King explicitly justifies disobedience in terms of morality, which for Arendt calls to mind the conscientious objector, not the civil disobedient. But yet King's disobedience was so successful because of its public nature and because of its group dimension. So the question is, to what extent is disobedience, which aspect of disobedience really captures what disobedience is? Is it its moral, is it the capacity of those engaged in civil disobedience to simply claim the moral high ground? Is that why it achieves its success? Or is it because of its public nature and because of its group dynamic? There's kind of two different, and for Arendt, it's going to be clear that it's not, that civil disobedience for Arendt is not merely or reducible to a moral claim about the justice of the law. That is not the true nature of civil disobedience. And that is an interesting claim. So we're gonna come back to that. But I kind of wanted to put that in front of you now, is to use King, who we just read, as a way to kind of test what Arendt is going to be saying over these next 4 or 5 readings. Okay, so that's actually all I have by way of introduction today. I will continue to try to, I don't know that I'll have one, I'll try to make these for Wednesday and Friday's readings as well, and I'll try to get those posted by Wednesday. But so again, reminder, quiz Wednesday, analysis group 3 Friday. I will talk to you all soon. Be safe, be healthy, be well.